Here we are. We're back again. This is Climate Finance and the Carbon Markets, brought to you from Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. I'm Professor Charles Bedford, and today's special guest is Sascha Müller-Kraenner, who is in Berlin, a longtime environmental activist, old friend of mine who shared tenure with me at the Nature Conservancy. Welcome, Sascha.
Thank you, Charles.
So, Sascha, we're talking. We have a great group of students who are and people who are interested in climate issues around the world. And what we'd love to talk to you today about is climate policy in Europe. But we want first to know just sort of your personal journey. Where have you come from, and where are you headed, and what are you doing right now? Tell us a little bit of background.
Well, I've basically been in the environmental community for the last 3 decades. Started in the early 90s in the east of Germany, rebuilding democracy. I was chief of staff of a fledgling parliamentarian then. So, and from then on, I actually moved in the European and international level. I worked for the umbrella organization of the German NGOs, built their European program, built their climate program. Went to the US, my first experience with the US for a German foundation. Again, worked a lot on transatlantic climate stuff. And after that, I joined the Nature Conservancy, leading global conservation organization. So working on conservation, working on climate policy on the national, European, global level. That's basically been the 3 decades of my life. And so I'm still doing it.
Sounds good. And tell us a little bit about Deutsche Umwelthilfe. I'm sure I'm saying it wrong, but tell us sort of what the mission and focus is for the organization you're currently running and have been for 7 years.
Actually, perfect pronunciation, Deutsche Umwelthilfe. It's not easy, I understand that, but perfectly done. It's one of the leading German environment and consumer advocacy organization. We do a lot of campaigning around issues like climate change, like conservation, like circular economy. We do a lot of strategic litigation. Just last year, we achieved a historic Constitutional Court ruling that made climate protection a basic law in Germany. And we do a lot of public education, in particular around consumer issues.
One of the things that I think is not really appreciated very much is the level of commitment from Germany over the last really 3 or 4 decades around environment and conservation and climate, and what a leader the German state has been in these conversations. I think people kind of underappreciate the power that has come out of Germany. Why is that? What drives the German people, the German government, German corporate sector to take this probably more seriously, this civilizational threat, taking it more seriously than anybody else? What's the secret?
Well, if you go back some decades, the late 80s, the early 90s, there was a very early political and scientific consensus in Germany. There was a parliamentary commission in the end of the 80s that basically said what we all know now, that climate change is a threat. So their foresights were actually pretty accurate. And they came up with the first targets for decarbonization. That was at an early stage embraced by the German government. So it has always been a consensus in principle. Now, Germany being a middle-sized country, well, important economically, but not as strong when compared to others like, let's say, China or the US. Germany always tried to achieve progress on climate change within the EU and on the global stage. So heavy engagement in European processes and global processes. Some lack of implementation, so strong targets, but sometimes, well, lack of implementation on the national level, in particularly when it came to key industries, key sectors like the German car industry. But we have a certain continuity of ambitious climate policy in the country.
And that's not just about sort of laws in Germany, but it also really comes in terms of, especially in the last 20 years, around the leadership in the European Union, I guess, as well. Is that fair to say? The European Union probably would not be where it is right now on climate without the German kind of push all along the way.
Well, there have been ups and downs. There have been other countries too, the Scandinavian countries, very progressive, the Dutch for a certain period of time, the UK when they were still in Germany, now France, the French government is relatively ambitious. But Germany has always been one of the countries that, were in favor of not only a strong Europe-wide climate target, but also of a package of measures, cross-sectoral regarding energy production, electricity production, energy efficiency, and that's how it continues to work. There is always let's say a positive competition of setting targets, making progress on the national level, on the member state level, and on the European level. Right now, we have an EU climate target to decarbonize the EU by 2050, to make Europe the first carbon neutral continent. And some countries obviously move ahead, and some are a little bit more slower.
Sure. And Germany's also had sort of an outsized influence in the UN and with allies like the US. You personally had some involvement in that kind of the dialogue with the US, both in your role in sort of the transatlantic work that you did with the Boll Foundation, as well as with the Nature Conservancy. What can you say about the influence that Germany's had on the US, either positively or negatively, or both?
Well, the thing is, there has always been a strong belief in the German political elite in the United Nations system. And I think it's fair to say that that belief is not shared by everyone in the US political system, and particularly in the Republican Party in the US. A lot of people are very skeptical towards international treaties, and that has shown, in particular around an issue like climate change. So starting with President Bush, the senior Bush in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit, a major UN conference where he was very reluctant. He finally accepted an international climate treaty. Then the US not signing up to the Kyoto Protocol, the first sub-treaty to the UN climate treaty that set binding targets for industrial countries. The Europeans were part, the US was not. So there were ups and downs. And generally speaking, every time when there was a democratic administration in the White House, collaboration was quite productive, as it is now when there were Republican leaders, in particular under President Trump. Relationship turned very sour, and there was no constructive dialogue on climate change. Well, we have a very interesting development now, because just this week, the German foreign minister announced a new special climate envoy. And she's actually a US citizen, Jennifer Morgan. She worked for Greenpeace International. She's a US environmental activist now, married with a German. She will get a German passport. So we have a very interested person that kind of embodies this transatlantic climate collaboration.
Interesting. Yeah. No, it's the ups and downs, I think, depending upon the party, is one of the problems that we have, I think, in America. Calling you, of course, today from Hong Kong, but that is, the actions have been less than satisfactory, at least with respect to climate on these issues over the years. The failure to sign the various treaties, and even, I think, Paris agreements. Essentially, we had John Kerry sign up to sign the Americans up for the Paris Agreement, but really most treaties should go through the Congress, and everyone knows that you can't get these treaties through the Congress to make them legally binding. So it's always a half measure when the Americans sign a treaty, I think. So maybe the new administration working with the Biden administration can help this along. Would you attribute, where do you put Angela Merkel in to the sort of pantheon of climate activism, climate commitment, either sort of at the macro level as well as in Germany? How do you place her role in Germany, in the US, in the EU, and globally?
Well, Angela Merkel has been in power for 16 years, which I would say is too long. And to start with. No one should run a government for 16 years. That's number one, which I have to say. She had a lot of international experience. She moved a lot of things on the international stage, in particularly on climate change within the G7, which in the G20, within the UN. She was behind getting the Paris Agreement done, but compared to her leading role, her critical role on the international stage, her performance on the national level was disappointing. And at the end of the day, well, her political party, the Christian Democrats, which are kind of the conservative party of Germany, were always, pro-business in the classic sense, defending old industries like the car industry, the chemical industries, the classic industrial powerhouses of Germany against, new industrial forces like the renewable energy industry. And a lot of things that were started by the previous government, which was run by the Social Democrats and the Green Party, were, slowed down again. The build out of renewables, for example. One thing she got done was the phase out of nuclear energy. But on the positive side, slow progress with renewables and almost no progress on cleaning up the German car industry, which is one of the main impediments that we have to progressive climate action. So we have a new government now in place, again with the Social Democrats, the Green Party and the Liberals, and they have an ambitious reform agenda, particularly on the climate front, but there's a lot to catch up on.
Interesting. It's important, I think, that for people to kind of realize that she was the right end of the spectrum, not the far to the right, but center right end of the political spectrum in Germany. She'd probably be on the left in the U.S. and I wonder where she falls in other countries. But an interesting episode. Personally, quite an appealing person, and someone who has a lot of respect, I think, around the world because of her work and her sort of personal work ethic. Let's talk a little bit about sort of a couple of items which I wanted to, around climate. First off, sort of the European market, the EU emissions trading system. How did this come about? What was why did Europe embrace so early and so aggressively a market-based mechanism for carbon, for reducing carbon? Well, because it could have certainly gone a different way. We could have done a tax. It could have regulated, emissions more. But they chose this market-based mechanism, and there have been bumps along the way. But tell us a little bit of the story as you have a view of it from Germany.
Well, there's always been a debate from the early 90s on, and whether the focus should be more on regulation or whether the focus should be more on market-based mechanisms. And at the end, we got a mix. And politicians cannot choose technologies. At least they cannot choose them to a certain extent. They have to rely on the forces of the market. And the debate has always been: is a tax would a carbon tax be the better approach? And most member states in the EU have carbon taxes in one way or another. Germany has an energy tax, has a lot of taxation on gasoline, relatively high taxes on gasoline, for example. But at the end of the day, an emission trading system was chosen because a trading system allows to set a cap on emissions and then, decrease the cap step by step. And that has actually had quite an effect over the last years. It needed some years. There were some beginners' mistakes in designing the system, but now the system works quite well. And in particular, it has, one of the main effects has been the phase out of coal. We have a de facto phase out of coal in all of Europe. There are some member states that traditionally rely heavily on coal. Germany is one of them, but also countries like Poland or the Czech Republic. But coal is on its way out, both lignite and hard coal, and that is due to the carbon price. Similar things will apply to gas at some point. And what is now being debated is whether the emission trading system, which currently covers the energy producing sector and heavy industry, should be expanded to the heating sector and to the transport sector. We have a separate emission trading system for heating and transportation in Germany. And the current debate is whether we get that on the EU level too. There is some hesitancy in some member states because that might improve cost, in particularly for, well, housing and for, well, using transportation for cars. And that has, distributional effects, that has social effects on, people that are relatively poor. So the current discussion is, well, if we get that this would be coupled by a social intervention fund that would help, well, socially disadvantaged groups cover the cost or recover the costs. But it's not a done deal yet. It's still an open debate whether we will get that extension or whether in the sectors of transport or heating, the focus will be more on regulation or also getting them into the carbon trading system.
Let's dig in a little bit on that, because it's such an interesting topic and the politics plays in so dramatically, right? So if you take Poland, for example, there's been a fair bit of pushback against the ETS because of the rising price of the cap and trade, the allocations, this last year in particular, where the price went from, I think, something like 20 euros to 90 euros. That kind of 4.5-fold increase. The Poles basically said, well, that's just too fast for us. You're going to bankrupt us and or put our coal plants out of business. And I think a lot of the Europeans initially said, well, yeah, that's the idea. That's the whole point, is to get rid of the coal thing. And but the Poles, I think, come back with a little bit of a like, well, we need more time to transition. We need to make more have a little bit more time on this front. And are these cracks in the foundation, or are these just of the whole ETS system that we're looking at now, especially in winter time when heating costs are now being blamed on carbon pricing all over the world? Are we looking at cracks in it, or is this something that is just going to come and go and eventually get sorted?
Well, to a certain extent, heating prices are blamed on carbon, but to the larger extent, currently heating prices are being blamed on the Russians, and this is where a country like Poland comes in. And Poland might be extremely sensitive towards increasing carbon prices on coal, because they are. Well, absolutely speaking, Germany has the largest chunk of coal because it's a larger economy, but relatively speaking to the size of the economy, Poland has the largest share of coal in the EU. However, Poland is extremely keen to get out of coal for a number of reasons. Well, first, the mines are running low. They are already starting to import coal and gas from where? From Russia. And there are also air quality issues. So this is more of an issue in Poland, a huge air quality problem. So Poland wants to get out of coal too, just a little bit more slowly. One of the dominating factors in the debate of the coming years will be, energy independency from, in particular, from gas imports. The current crisis we have around Ukraine, has huge effects on energy prices. The imports of gas have been heavily reduced from Russia because, the Russians are not sending gas through the pipelines that go through Ukraine anymore. That has had a huge effect on gas prices, and in particular countries like Poland, like the Baltic countries, the other Central Eastern European member states of the EU, they have understood that they have to get rid of that heavy reliance on fossil energies, and the future is renewables in some member states focus on nuclear. Poland has no nuclear power yet, and unclear whether they'll get it, but others like the Czech Republic focus on that. And I wouldn't call the discussion that we're having now I wouldn't call it cracks in the foundation of the emission trading system. It's a negotiating process. It's 27 economies, very different economic structures, very different energy supply systems. And it's a wheeling and dealing. At the end, there will be a compromise and some money will be sent back and forth. And it'll always be a package of, a common target and financial compensation for some who feel that they need compensation.
Got it. Let's dig in a little bit on the sort of the renewables side of it and then nuclear. You couldn't imagine a more different perspective than the French and the German perspective on nuclear power, right? In fact, it was just today I read that France is planning to bring another 15 nuclear power plants online. There are 70 or so, 70 or more than 70% powered by nuclear power. And Germany's made a decision on the other way. You had a reasonably good working nuclear facilities, pretty good safety record, but basically said, no, that we're gonna try it without reliance on nuclear. We're gonna go with renewables as much as we can. Can what's the thinking there to give us kind of both the French and the German perspective on this and how that looks, at a European, European Union as a whole? Who's going to follow whom, I guess?
Well, the interesting thing is when you go back to the 70s, both France and Germany had huge programs to expand nuclear power. So the programs are very similar. And then in the 80s, there was a critical discussion on negative effects of nuclear, nuclear accidents, nuclear spillovers, the question where to put the waste. So very similar public debates, huge protests in France too. But at the end of the day, my belief is the reason why it turned out differently in Germany and France is very different political system. France, a very centralized country, decisions are being made by a political elite that comes from, a small group of elite universities. So it's a very small group in a centralized governed country that basically runs the show, very technocratic thinking. Germany, very decentralized country. The government is much weaker, much stronger role for the judiciary. And that decentralized structure gave a much stronger role to civil society organizations who raised their voice, who protested, went the legal avenue. And therefore, at the end of the day, the buildup of nuclear in Germany was slowed down. And then when the Greens entered government in '98, the decision was made to phase out nuclear. In fact, we're shutting down the last 3 plants that we still have end of this year, and then we're out. And no one challenges that. They say there's a broad consensus that nuclear is not the future. On the other hand, in France, the French have a very old fleet of nuclear power plants. And I also saw President Macron's announcement yesterday, where he said they want to build 6 new power plants and possibly another 8 more. But it's an announcement. And I've heard loads of those announcements. And as everyone knows who makes New Year's, announcements about smoking, about drinking and whatever else, there's a huge difference between the announcement and doing it. And I haven't seen that new generation of nuclear power plants nowhere in Europe, and in particular not in France. They have started building one. It's years over time. It's not finished yet. They're basically working with the same old fleet of power plants. They're expanding the lifetime now to 50 years. They were originally constructed for 30 years, and the main reason why the French are doing that is because they're behind on building out renewables. And I saw the evening news yesterday when President Macron made that announcement. And he didn't only talk about nuclear, he also talked about wind power, 70 huge offshore wind parks in the French coast. They have a huge wind potential offshore, onshore. So within the French economy, it will also be a competition, and basically an economic competition between wind power, which is getting cheaper, and nuclear, which is becoming more complex. So I think it remains to be seen whether we will see any of those 15 power plants that Macron announced yesterday.
Yeah, it's a little bit, I think, what we've for those of us who've been working in the environmental movement for a long time, you start to get a little bit cynical about the announcements that politicians make, and I think also about the announcements that corporates make.
There's a very interesting guy, Michael Schneider. He publishes something called the World Nuclear Review. He's actually a German who's married to a French. He lives in Paris, actually in a very smart apartment. I visited him. And he publishes this annual report where he compares nuclear reactors under planning and announcements and those who are actually built. And that's a huge discrepancy.
Well, that reminds, and that the reason I raised this sort of the pledges versus the reality is that so many countries and companies have made these very ambitious pledges to become carbon neutral by 2050 or carbon neutral by 2040, or some of the corporate pledges are to become carbon zero by 2025, and the taxonomy is very confusing, but there's a lot of pledges. Now, in the case of companies, there's at least boards and exchanges and other investor pressure to keep the heat on companies to keep their pledges. In the case of countries, I mean, you have electoral processes, but typically, if you're making a pledge that's 20 or 30 years out, you can sort of say whatever you want. How much these are, and the UN system is obviously not built to provide legal mechanisms for enforcement of these treaties, but how worried should we be about the pledges that have been made and whether or not they're going to be fulfilled by countries like the US, Russia, China, the European Union? It seems to me like the European Union has a pretty decent shot at this. The Americans, I can't imagine. The Chinese, maybe. The Russians, probably not. Is that your take as well? Where do you place the sort of likelihood of achieving these pledges that politicians have made?
Well, pledges are pledges, and they're easy to make, and normally they are some decades ahead, and you're not in charge anymore when you miss them. So what you have to put in place is mechanisms that make sure the pledges are being reached, and one of them is the carbon trading system, because when you have a cap on carbon licenses and a tradable system, well, then you just can move within the system. Otherwise, you have to stop running your power plant, for example. That's one thing. The carbon, obviously, politicians can always, increase the cap if the pressure is too high, but at least for the time being, there is a cap on the overall amount, which can be legally enforced. The second thing that we have now is we had this Constitutional Court ruling, which we instigated, our organization in Germany. And our Constitutional Court has ruled that we have a limited carbon budget for Germany. And that budget has to be, there must be a credible plan how to achieve that. So in constitutional law, we basically can sue governments. They have to put measures in place, and those measures have to be plausible. And so somehow we have to get to the target. We will probably do the same thing with a number of companies. There has been a landmark legal case against Shell, and we actually, me in person, I've sued BMW, Mercedes, and Wintershall, which is the largest German oil and gas company, to become carbon neutral. We see where this will be going. Our first case against Mercedes will be in court in June. That'll be exciting. We'll see where that gets. So we think in a legal space like the EU, where we have working institutions and rule of law, we can make sure that those pledges are being turned into, concrete commitments that can be legally enforced, like everywhere else. A pledge to get the country crime-free is nothing worth if you don't have police on the street. Same with environmental commitments. In the international space, I don't know. We have different political systems in different countries. You all know that. Internationally, there are limited possibilities for sanctions. We cannot send the United Nations troops to other countries to enforce climate pledges, and we wouldn't want to do that. So there, I would say it boils down to economic and political competition, which system is more successful. And I've always said, well, we in Europe, we have to prove that we can get this done and still be an attractive and economically successful place. Well, if we end up dirt poor and it's just a mess, people will say this is not a model for us. But if we can prove that we can prosper with green technologies, then others will say, well, hey, maybe that wasn't the worst idea. And that's basically the master plan, if you want to say that.
Yeah. No, it's well said, and I think Europe, because of the union and the way that the union works, and then the member states and the way that you all have made headway on things like taxes and regulation and the cap and trade systems capture other industries, not just the heavy stuff, is quite a good example. The Americans have a tougher time because it's a very decentralized system. The Californians have kind of put something in place, in league with Quebec in Canada. The Northeast states have also have a market in place, but the federal government seems to be completely disinclined in the U.S. to put in place either a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, and it's not even on the horizon of the agenda. Where do you see that going? It seems very discouraging for the world to have that world leader, whether you like it or not, to be so slow on climate.
It's obviously a huge challenge, and when I think about where do we have opportunities? Well, I can analyze the situation and say it's dismal and it's a huge mess, but that doesn't get me anywhere. So my approach always is, well, let's look at the glass, and even if there's very little in it, let's just say it's half full. And when I think about the European-US climate collaboration, what we can do, for example, is we can collaborate on technology. For example, one thing where the US is ahead, or at least one huge company, US company, Tesla, is ahead, is on electric mobility. Let's collaborate on things like that. Let's collaborate on things like battery technology, like storage for renewable electricity. Let's collaborate on some economic mechanisms like carbon border adjustment mechanisms, where we protect, clean industries against competitors from other places who might not have to cope with the carbon price. Those kind of things where technological interests meet. I have understood that the US government, independent of who runs it, is not a huge believer in the United Nations and in global governance. That's just a fact. It's a different political system, different tradition. I may deplore that. Well, it's basically all the guys who fled from Europe because they didn't like the bureaucracy and regulation that we had in Europe, and they found that the US, it might go back to that.
That's a good diagnosis of the American psyche, right? It's a bunch of folks who left Europe because they couldn't stand anybody telling them what to do, and maybe that's the problem we currently are continuing to deal with. Well, it's really useful to have that kind of perspective, and your point on a glass that's only got a little bit in it, but call it half full is, I think, a good lesson for all of the people who want to kind of go forward and make a difference on conservation and climate. So yeah, thank you for your perspective on that. One last sort of topic I wanted to cover with you, Sascha, are the carbon markets outside of Europe and the voluntary markets. So essentially, companies which have pledged to become carbon neutral are now basically figuring out how to weed out their own, take out their own or reduce their own carbon footprint, reduce the carbon footprint of the indirect causes of their emissions, and then also take out the supply chain, and then to offset the rest. Now, over the course of the last 20 years, through the UN process and the Clean Development Mechanism, and then ultimately then a series of NGOs which have taken over from the CDM, a carbon markets sprung up, right? Where not that much money, but some money. I think $300 or $400 million a year or two ago, and this last year, $1 billion is being churned into carbon reduction and carbon mitigation projects around the world. What's the future of that? Is this just a transient sort of transition mechanism until we can get all the countries of countries of the world to regulate companies and regulate carbon emissions, or is this something that's here to stay? Where do you view the voluntary carbon market and that its place in the in the whole system?
Well, I believe that they are complementary. It's important to have the regulated carbon market because only governments can basically set a legally binding cap. And but when I look, for example, at a role like when I look at a company, and when I look at the major, let's say, oil and gas companies that we have in Europe, well, they obviously have with their operations, they have to move within the European cap and trade system. So for what they do in Europe, well, they have to respect the legally binding carbon cap, and they have to buy carbon credits if they want to continue to operate. But this only goes for their emissions that are actually happening in Europe. So in refineries, for example. But there are things. They are the emissions that are happening upstream, where they drill for oil and gas in other places outside of the European borders. Then there's the question: what about their products? If you have a company like Shell, well, it's not the Shell refineries. They are part of the problem, but when you look at the whole system, they drill for oil at the coast of at the African coast. They bring it to Europe, then they refine it, then they sell it in the form of gasoline or diesel. So if I only look at the refinery, which falls under the cap and trade system, which is regulated, that's fine. But large parts of the responsibility is the whole supply chain, and for that, those voluntary commitments they can complement their legal commitments. And this is where it comes in. A company that wants to look at the whole picture would also take that into account and say, we have a responsibility that goes beyond our own operations, because through our buying decisions or investment decisions, we have an impact far beyond our own building block. And there you can come in with those voluntary things and say, well, let's account for it and let's somehow compensate what we do.
Got it. So there's the voluntary markets come under criticism for a couple of reasons. One, some projects are dodgy, not as well designed, and maybe overstate their emission captures. Fair enough. That seems fixable. Another thing that seems less fixable is the criticism that people like George Monbiot recently leveled, basically saying, no, look, you can't allow companies to offset their tier 3 or emissions. It actually is a cause of environmental collapse. So he basically rejects the whole notion of a voluntary carbon market and the ability of corporates to essentially to participate in that, because he feels like it's greenwashing, I guess. Where's that coming from? Is it just a very radical view, or is it something that's shared by a lot of European Greens, or what's your sense of that sort of worry that he has that the voluntary carbon markets provide a greenwashing opportunity and will allow for companies to continue their emissions activities unabated?
Sure, they do, and that is why we need more accountability in the system. For example, when I go to the gas station up the street where I live, and that's a Shell gas station, and they sell carbon neutral gasoline, and they have deforestation projects both in Germany and abroad, and that's an open question to ask, as whether this is an adequate form to compensate for their emissions, for the emissions of the gasoline. Now, I would say that as long as a company like Shell has a credible decarbonization pathway, let's say, as they claim they want to become a company by 2050 that is totally carbon neutral. They want to invest in renewable energies and other things like that. And so if on the way to that objective, they compensate the emissions that happen on the road through meaningful deforestation projects, why not? I don't have a problem with that. I would agree that there are dodgy projects that are better projects, and normally you recognize them by price. I recently had a meeting with Kyocera, Japanese office supply of printers and things like that. They have a huge they have a huge business here in Germany, and they some years ago advised us on carbon offsets, and we gave them some advice. And recently their CEO came to us and he asked me, look, well, we are buying those carbon credits. We do some conservation projects in Africa. Now, I had someone come to me and say, I can do the same thing for you for 10% of the price. You get carbon credits, but it's much cheaper. Why shouldn't I do that? And I told him, look, it's like you go to the supermarket. You get a champagne for €5 or you get one for 50. Where do you think the price difference comes from? It's quality. So think about it. So that's. I think we need more transparency, and we need more watchdog organizations for the private carbon market. And we also have to put things in perspective. It plays a role, but it cannot substitute getting out of fossil energy. It's just an interim measure to do good while you still have to use it.
Yeah. I mean, some industries are really going to be tough to decarbonize, and that sort of speaks to a little bit of the aviation industry. If you play the clock forward 10 or 15 or 20 years, it's hard to imagine battery powered planes. Maybe, and maybe there's, I don't know whether you can really call aviation fuel sustainable in any meaningful way, but maybe there is a set of things like that. But it seems like there's some things that we're going to end up having to burn fossil fuels for ultimately.
Well, on aviation, we've actually had some meaningful conversations with Lufthansa and Airbus. Airbus, supplying a huge part of the world market, and they are both putting some research in hydrogen. So I think hydrogen is part of the future, green hydrogen, and Airbus has now already started the first planes that use green hydrogen from wind power. And that may be the future. Whether this can meet the demand the airline industry now has is a question. But I also think, at least for the European air transport market, that it will not come out of the Corona pandemic as it has gotten in. So I think the times of eternal growth in the air traffic sector are over.
Yeah. That's well put.
It may not be the case in Asia. I don't know about that, but here definitely, that cannot be a sector that grows all the time. So we have to put more investment in high-speed trains, things like that. But of all the options for the air transportation sector, I think the green hydrogen one is the most plausible option. It seems to work technologically. It's not competitive yet, but let's work on it.
Before we sign off, and I don't want to keep you too long, Sascha, talk a little bit about China. I know you've spent time thinking about and time in China, and China's role. China has a new nationwide carbon market based on carbon intensity. It's got a number of regional carbon markets that have been in place for a number of years. They seem to be taking this pretty seriously. They've got 1.4 billion people, and they're now the biggest emitter for the last 4, 5, 6, 8 years, I think. Where do you think China's role, how will China's role evolve over the next 10 years in terms of climate leadership, both internationally, but also their plan to decarbonize?
Well, we cannot address the climate problem without China. It's not the largest emitter. It's still growing, and there has been a lot of progress both on the policy front in China, the development of carbon markets, you just described that. There has been a lot of investment in green technologies. They are now world leaders on renewables, on electric cars, things like that. But they're also still the most polluting economy on the planet. I'm a little bit concerned regarding the transparency of the political commitments that are made in China. It's all very top-down. There is very little, public scrutiny, accountability, weak civil society, and I think a system where you have checks and balances and things that can be put on the spotlight is more resilient at the end of the day. Collaboration with China on climate policy in general, but also on developing the necessary technologies, also for other markets in Africa, in other parts of Asia, in Latin America, will be critical to address. I know those are very general remarks, but
no, it's fine. Yeah, no, I mean, it's one of those things where climate may not be able to be the tail that wags the dog of the transparency problem in China, but it's certainly a problem with a system that doesn't have that kind of accountability. But maybe they're serious enough and technocratic and technical enough to make this work, despite that lack of kind of traditional Western style transparent mechanisms and feedback loops. We'll see. I guess the jury is still out. Well, I want to wrap up and just say thank you very much, Sascha, for the time today. It's great to catch up with you again. It was super fun to work with you at the Nature Conservancy for those years we overlapped, and I appreciate the leadership you've taken since then, and leading one of Germany's biggest NGOs in these pretty dramatic wins that you've managed is pretty awesome. So congratulations on that. Congratulations, especially. I think it's easy to miss the fact that that you've essentially got the German government and the Federal Constitutional Court to essentially say that climate for future generations is a constitutional right. That's remarkable, an incredible coup for you and personally, and for the organization you work for as well. So congratulations on that.
Well, thanks, George. And I hope to come back to Hong Kong so that we can continue that conversation with you and the students here.
Yeah, well, we'd love to have you. We have a long quarantine in place here at the moment, but I suspect
I think I will wait until that quarantine is not necessary anymore.
Exactly. All right. Thank you so much, Sascha.